tried to put together the talk today to give you some sense of some of the technologies that we proposed as part of the SEED project, and kind of have some of the technology and sort of practical ideas in there, but it's also sort of influenced, I think, both long-term from, I think the first time I came up to Michigan was way back when it was the Science of Collaboratories project, trying to look at how all the different collaboratories were out there, what was working, what wasn't working, could we sort of turn that from an art to a science. So all the social technical infrastructure and all that kind of comes from way back then. And this summer, over the last several months, I've been part of the W3C provenance working group, where we've been trying to get a provenance standard, but also thinking about provenance of not, I'll explain more during the talk, but basically not just things like files that get processed and produce a new file, but mutable things like cells and people, and how would you actually record that. And it's been a very interesting trip that's gone all the way down into philosophy and 2,000-year-old paradoxes in philosophy and everything. So I'm going to try and start this sort of from a requirements and philosophical bent, and I will get to the technologies and kind of give you some practical stuff as we get going. Get a hold of the right thing here. So basically what I wanted to talk about was really to kind of ask the question that I think is generally relevant everywhere, is to sort of ask, if this is such a hard problem, but we've been working at it a while, why isn't it done yet, right? What are people missing? What's not right? Is it just a matter of resources and do the same thing or not? And I want to kind of walk through what I think, how I think data integration is framed today, and then kind of where are the challenges that we're sort of not admitting to. And then start talking about this idea of knowledge spaces, which again is like everything else, you have to come up with a fancy new term to mean sort of incremental modifications and integrations of other things. So you'll see things you recognize under the term, but talk about some of the things that are listed there in terms of context of things, and semantic web and provenance and so on are all in there. And then as I get towards the end, I basically want to kind of go all the way around to part of the fun of going to Rensselaer is that I've also gotten a little bit closer to the academic side and actually been to some cognitive science presentations and so on, where they're starting to ask about how the brain functions. And so this starts to tie together in my brain with the kind of things we're trying to do in technology, has some overlap. So I'll give you like 1 or 2 slides to kind of just make it fun at the end there. Okay, so why isn't data integration done already? The usual answer you get is kind of along the lines of the Tower of Babel. People use different languages, they use different terms, they have different identifiers, and there's a lot of work to match those together. You might admit, kind of going out far enough, that things are in different units, so you've got to go from English units to metric units, so the numbers don't quite match up. You might be in different coordinate systems, so you've got to go from, in environmental research, there are people who measure how far out are you, how far up a tree are you out, and how far out on the limb are you, rather than GPS coordinates, and you have to map across those. But in a lot of sense, it's really things that end up sounding fairly mechanical at the end of the day. And we have a lot of best practices that have been developed, and again, that in itself, I'll admit, is a hard problem, but we've kind of got a lot of machinery in place to take a look at that, right? Since you know that these things are things that get stored in multiple places, and you've got communities that want to look at them, you start using global IDs. You talk about ontologies and community vocabulary, so that you actually know that your terms are well defined and you're sharing those, as opposed to, what does TEMP mean in the database? Well, it's really so-and-so's definition of what temperature is. Now we understand we're talking temperature, and we know it's whether it's Celsius or Fahrenheit and so on. You standardize the units, so you pick Celsius or Fahrenheit so that you're all writing the same numbers. You standardize access, you do web services, you do linked open data, things like that, so you have a mechanism to get to it. You break your models into small pieces and kind of recognize that everybody has projects with experiments and so on, and that doesn't necessarily change between disciplines, or everybody thinks about Dublin core and creators of things and creation dates. You don't have to have one for biology, chemistry, and physics, but you've got molecules and other things that are domain dependent. So break those apart, use them mixed together. And you do things like ontologies, where again, you don't necessarily want to write down everything all the time. So you'll have things like, a cow is a herbivore, therefore it's going to eat plants, not animals, and you can infer the missing pieces from the fact that, if I write that there's a cow, you can kind of wander through the fact that it's a class herbivore and get some additional information, and we can automate producing that information. And again, I'll treat provenance a little bit separately at the end, but I kind of want to put out here again, we've had for a while now that the notion that I've got a file, I ran a process, I've got another file coming out. That kind of stuff, we're reasonably well able to describe that when that happens, so we can even put a time dimension in that way. So, just a matter of time till we finish up, right? Thanks for any questions. Let's get done here. I think, you know, basically, if that's not the answer and this isn't the end of the talk, we've got two choices, right? We either go back to this one and say there's some missing best practices, that these are still too hard and we've got to change the practice just to get more mechanics to solve the problem. Or what I want to do with you is basically go, let's see, trying to go forward. I didn't copy one extra slide in here. Or you can go back and basically question if this is the problem that you want to solve. Right? Is this really the problem with data integration or not? And so if you'll forgive me to hop through a couple of slides again. So really, I think I want to digress just a little bit and talk about elephants, cows, and butterflies, and in doing so, try and convince you that problem statement that this is all mechanical integration kind of issues is really not the case. So if we talk about elephants, I'm talking mostly about, you know, think of the blind man and the elephant kind of concept. There are really a lot of different things we mean by elephant. We can look at different parts, and that you're actually not talking about the same thing when you say I study elephants. People use different techniques. They're worried about, you know, mass and the pressure that you put on the floor, or they're worried about the psychology of elephants and their IQ and how they think, or they're thinking about their chemistry and their genetic sequence. Those are not really things that line up very well, right? There's not necessarily one common vocabulary that covers an elephant as a chemical object, as a physical object, as a living animal. Those sort of don't connect in a way that you could mechanically say, well, I'm just going to give you one elephant definition and I'm going to cover all of it.
So Jim,
yep.
Is volume placed there because it's the volume of the elephant or the volume of the output?
It was meant to be the volume of the elephant, but now that you say it. Yes, that's perhaps not the best place to put that. Although there are people who study that, and sadly we'll get to that on the next slide a little bit. So just trying to point out on this that again, if you really think about what we do in scientific investigation, we do a lot of controlled experiments where we try and hold constant some things and then don't even bother to measure them, or certainly don't talk about them. So we assume the elephant's genetic sequence is not changing, and then we talk about how the elephant moves around the room if we're doing kinetics of an elephant walking. We don't want to record all those things. We don't want to have a vocabulary that forces us to put all that information down. We want to simplify our lives. So there's a lot of that kind of issue in here. And I can make it even worse with spherical cows. Spherical cows are you know, sort of a physicist joke of you know, how physicists see the real world and how they oversimplify. But you know, a spherical cow model isn't that bad if you're trying to do metabolism of a cow, right? So you're trying to figure out, if I've got this mass of tissue that is metabolizing, so as food goes in and energy gets produced, and you want to get the temperature of a cow, that's not a bad approximation. You can do some real science with that. And as soon as you're trying to get the spherical cows to walk into a truck and move them around or anything else, right, this thing falls over. It's not a good model of a cow. But if you talk to the researchers, they'll both say, yeah, I study cows, right? So clearly it must be one object. And I think part of what we've recognized through the provenance working group is that we do an awful lot of that, where we've actually made some simplifying assumptions about what we're talking about. We didn't tell anybody, and we all use the same term for it. And as soon as you do that, you get stuck with lots and lots of paradoxes. And I think I'm trying to read my own slide here with, you know, it's not that these things are completely separate. So again, if I have a spherical cow, if I assumed a standard cow rectangular shape, I could give you some sense from my spherical cows of how tall they are, how wide they are, and so on, and the fact that there's a variation because I've got smaller cows and bigger cows in my spherical model. So I can actually do some sort of modeling to move across from one model to another, but it's not necessarily standard, and I could start thinking about not only do I have a standard volumetric rectangle, but maybe that varies by species. So if I want to get a better approximation, give you better numbers, I have to do a little bit more modeling and have a little bit more metadata about my cows before I can get across. There's these kinds of things going on when we're trying to do data integration as well. And by the way, part of what you do as a scientist all the time is you say the last theory isn't right. I've got to consider the cow from a different angle. I've got to consider its isotopic balance or the cow as a quantum mechanical object, and now I can do new things that you didn't, so please give me the grant, right? So almost everything you do in science is invent a new theory that has one more parameter and actually changes the meaning of that object. Okay, and so let me go on even to butterflies. We can make it even worse, right? Where's the butterfly in the picture? And if you want to start asking the question of what's the mass of the butterfly, or where's, what's the mass of the butterfly, right? Is it the caterpillar mass? Is it the caterpillar plus the chrysalis? Is it when it's a butterfly? Almost everybody, if you ask them, is a butterfly a physical thing? Is it made up of atoms? They would say yes. If you ask them which ones, they could point to it at a given point in time. And then as soon as you start asking, well, which atoms are part of the butterfly over time, everyone will disagree, right? Some will say the butterfly didn't exist till it came out of the chrysalis. Other people say, oh no, some of the same atoms were in the caterpillar, that's really it. Someone will say, well, really, to get this right, you have to take the caterpillar and it turns into the chrysalis and the butterfly, and that's how you conserve mass and energy and so on. And again, we don't tell anybody this stuff. We don't write it down. We think it, but we have arguments actually because we don't even convey it to the person next to us. And then we certainly don't write it down on the computer. And I think that's again with the provenance working group, we've had a lot of discussions about, particularly when people have URIs for things out on the web or the semantic web, can we use those in provenance and make provenance statements around them? And what we're sort of finding out is that we give labels to things like a particular butterfly, and then we don't tell you what we meant by that butterfly 10 minutes ago and what mass it had. Or just think of a website with the weather, right? We give the weather a website, a URL, and then we don't tell you whether we mean today's weather every day or we mean last Tuesday's weather, and the URI is going to stay with that. We end up giving you one URL for both of those things, and then we don't know which one we're talking about. So I think the real integration challenges here are that we make a lot of these kinds of leaps between different theories as we talk about stuff. When we cross disciplines, we're actually in different theoretical contexts. Though we use the same words, if you really try and get precise and go all the way down from what does that word mean, what are the attributes that go with that type of thing that we can actually give a value for that we know is going to stay the same over time, what are we going to consider to be that thing 10 minutes from now, and do we diverge that way? You'll find out that happens all the time, and we're not recording it. So we need a way to do that. And so that's basically where I want to go next, is to start moving towards how can we do that in a better way than we're doing now. And again, I think part of the reason that we don't do this today is that, and as I'll try and come back to right at the end, is I think we're a machine, brain-wise, that we do this well naturally at a very low level, and so we don't even know we're not aware that we're doing it, and so therefore we are not aware that we have to write down and tell the computer this stuff, because we're just very good at saying, oh yeah, that person, they have a weight, but of course they eat and they change their weight, and of course I get an education because I think I'm going to be a different person when I come out of the education, but I don't want my driver's license to go away. This all makes perfect sense to everybody, right? I can flip back and forth between what I mean by person in my mind, and you guys all follow along pretty well. We still have an idea of what a person is, even though none of those things, sort of, if I try and really write it down logically, it's going to break all over the place. Okay, so with that, I just want to say very little bits about seed. I think you get to, you're here at Seed Central, so you're going to hear about this in lots of ways over time. Just wanted to introduce it sort of at the very highest level, and then talk about some of the technologies that we're going to apply in it. SEED was basically part of NSF's DataNet project, which is looking at trying to preserve data for the long term for various communities, and to do that in a cross-disciplinary way. SEED looked at sustainability research, which again, I'll show you in like 2 more slides. We're really talking about all the way from environmental to humans, human society, land use, and everything in between, sort of a coupled human-natural system type of research. And we put together in a proposal sort of a novel technical and business approach to look at how could we do better at what I'm talking to you about today. How could we do that in a sort of Web 2.0, Web 3.0 social networking way that's going to allow people to have a lot lower barrier to actually using these tools? How can we do that in a way that it can sustain itself over the next 100 years with only 5 or 10 years of NSF funding before it's got to be sort of self-sufficient, and those sorts of things. So that's what SEED is roughly about, and Margaret can tell you much more. Sustainability research, of course, is sort of the source of many of our grandest challenges in society today, from flooding and climate change to just trying to feed a growing population, worrying about things like water wars as water, we get more water and floods in one place and desertification in other places. As we try and make land use decisions, looking at what that's going to do to endangered species, you name it, right? They're all in there. We all are kind of very aware of this. There are certainly data challenges, and I think there are data challenges kind of all the way through the kinds of issues I was talking about. There are certainly many communities from, I don't know which one to point at here, they're sort of very much remote sensing and very standardized things where it's coming off a satellite. Now planes flying over to individual rovers that have their own flight paths and autonomously kind of wander around, to people going up in cranes looking at forests, to sensors that just kind of sit out there and send single numbers back over years and years. People have been looking at, my lake for a long time. People have been looking at sort of statistics around the globe. You can certainly find different units, different ideas, different concepts, different theories. People thinking of a lake as a thing versus it's actually part of an underground river and a watershed and the rain cycle in the area. These things are all over the place for us. So just to give you a sense that there are some, I'm not going to address these two directly, but just wanted to point out that we don't have to talk about elephants and spherical cows to kind of have problems that start to get into this. So if I want to know where all the rain gauges are in Ann Arbor, for example, chances are in the database they're actually in terms of GPS coordinates. So at the very least I have to do something, say, well, Ann Arbor must have some geographical boundary, and I've got to do something mathematically to figure out which GPS locations are inside that Ann Arbor boundary before I can give you the answer back. So again, I don't have, it's not just units, it's sort of, I have to have some geospatial understanding of how GPS fits inside of boundaries of geospatial objects before I can answer the question. If I look at that at a nice high level, sensors in Ann Arbor looks like a great semantic query, right? All those things are pretty well defined. I could think about a Sparkle question to do that, and yet I won't find any database where I can actually ask that question because it's all on GPS. So somebody's got to translate that. And it gets more fun that I'm sure a million years ago Ann Arbor didn't exist. I don't know how long it's been here, but there are things where if Ann Arbor has changed its boundaries over time, for some research I might actually have to say, well, I need to know, was it in Ann Arbor in 1962 or not? So you can see that it might not be something that, even though we might assume for a minute we'll agree where the GPS location is, we might not actually agree on where the Ann Arbor boundaries are unless we start talking about really specifically what dates. Did I mean the town or the city or the whatever? That may not be global knowledge anymore, right? That's something that I have to tell you, why do I want to use it, or what my definition of Ann Arbor is before I can really give you the answers back. Same thing, find me the temperature from noon to 2 p.m. last Tuesday. Systems write these into files. So for a long time, all the climate researchers, you have to go call some guy on the phone and say, I'm looking for the stuff from the year 1962. And he says, oh great, here's the file name, that's the one you want to retrieve. Because they had no sense that the data was actually part of a time stream about anything. So being able to ask again, it's not a bad semantic question to say, what was yesterday's data, or what was it from these 2 hours? And yet there's nothing that kind of gets you from there to where do I actually look on the disk to go pull those numbers back. So again, we've got a mismatch. We've got to put something in the middle. And again, we'll pull it really far and say, I'd really like to assess where the nitrogen's going, more like the butterfly example. I've got some farm data of when fertilizer went down. I've got some weather data that might suggest how much it got moved into runoff and went down the rivers. Got some flow gauges in there. but really to give you the answer, I've got really a full-blown model that has to be in there that's calibrated against all that data before I can even answer the question of where did that particular nitrogen go. So a very, very derived thing that sort of gets the whole scientific workflow in it. Okay, so let's try designing sort of up from those requirements. Rather than say we've got a relational database or we've got a file system, let's go and see how we can use it. Let's go the other direction and ask what are the characteristics of the systems we might need based on all the things we'd like to do with it. So one of the things that we know is that there are going to be many kinds of data, both raw data and derived data, right? There are lots of scientists, they're all doing something slightly different. We've got multiple types of sensors. We don't have central coordination on file formats in a lot of cases. There's going to be many providers out there, so the data won't necessarily be in the same place. And as soon as we build the system, nobody's going to stop doing research. They're going to come out with a new combined sensor with a new file format, and we've got to handle that one too. So we sort of have an answer for that, right? That this is what content management systems are for. Essentially a file system, file-like blob, but key value pair metadata around it. So there are certainly lots of local-oriented content management systems that have been out there for a long time, but let's take that design pattern. But let's just not assume that it's all going to be local and off of one system. If we're going to do that in a distributed way with distributed storage and distributed authorities, we're going to have global identifiers. We're going to have service interfaces on top of that. So if you know content management systems, there's a protocol called WebDAV, which was basically get and set the blob and get and set XML metadata on top of it. If we're going to have global identifiers and go semantic web, there are newer protocols, one called Eureka. They came from Nokia. That's basically the same thing. And if you really look at it, things like linked open data and so on are the same way. You can get and set the metadata, and you can find the data associated with that metadata and go pull that back over the web as well. So we got to take that design principle in here. And another one that I think is missed sometimes is that we're probably much more comfortable with talking about sorry, I shouldn't say comfortable. It's probably a lot more transportable to talk about things like the mass and weight of something and attributes of something than to really come down to, do we believe those are the attributes of the thing we want to talk about? So if I take a person, whether the weight of a person is something that characterizes them, and I should be able to query and say, find the 190-pound person in the room, or I say weight is something that changes all the time, and that's not going to give me a good answer. I need to go find their name and find people that way. We'll argue about that. We'll argue about sort of what is the person class that we want to deal with. Do people have phone numbers? Do they have two phone numbers? That's where we sort of are starting to put a theoretical context around, and we're going to get in trouble. But person has a phone number, that sort of lower level of here's some attributes that I want to associate, which is sort of the RDF level in the semantic stack, which is the key value pair kind of level, that you can use inside and outside of those different theoretical contexts, and they transfer across better. So you put all those three things together and essentially have the idea of a semantic content management framework. Get and set blobs of data, get and set metadata about it, do that through service interfaces, do that with global IDs, use standard RDF kind of technologies, use Sparkle for query language and so on. But we've also talked in here about this idea of perspective shifts, and that some of these things are not going to be universal. So again, we might consider GPS coordinates to be universal, but we might disagree about either what are the right boundaries we want to put sensors in, or what is the boundary of something like Ann Arbor if we're not going to worry about, or we are going to worry about its precise boundaries over time and so on. So you'd like to have the idea of a context where within that context you can say, you know, first of all, I'm going to control access to this, so this stuff is public, but this stuff is restricted to my group. But I'd like to be able to integrate the data across, but I'd like to be able to put access control so that only certain people can integrate all the data. Some people can see the public stuff. I'd like to be able to put constraints on there, so maybe I don't want to have people information if I don't have phone numbers. If I'm trying to do an enterprise database, if you don't tell me that you're an employee, I don't want to have you in my database. So I'd like to make sure that there's no person information going in unless it's associated with the companies. So I want to have a constraint. Certainly reasonable to talk about people with phone numbers outside the company, but not in my repository. So I need a context to put that constraint on and say, I'm going to keep my data sort of with this quality and this completeness. Approximation is the same way. If I'm going to say I'm going to assume Ann Arbor had static boundaries, and I'm going to give you the sensors that are in that static boundary no matter what time of your question, that's something that's not universal. I'd like to have a context that within that context, that's a valid assumption, and by using my context, you're going to accept that assumption when I give you data out. And now I'd be happy to give you answers about what sensors are in Ann Arbor. If somebody wants to have a different context where they say, well, I'm going to treat Ann Arbor as something that changes dimensions over time, when you use that context and you get what sensors in Ann Arbor, you're taking their assumption. So again, we need something to know that we've got a context and that you can deal with it. So that kind of approximation, that kind of assumption stuff. Also expect those shifts to involve both math and logic. Again, if I talk to semantic web folks, you probably are aware that when you go from RDF to OWL, then you get to inference and rules and other stuff up there, but you're always trying to use sort of various forms of logic to infer additional information. It's very hard to put things like GPS coordinates into that kind of framework about logic. It's much easier just say, I'm going to use a geospatial database and index and give that to you through a bunch of math and figure it out mathematically rather than trying to make that into a logic framework. So you want to have this idea of plugins where I can derive additional data both through logical operations and sort of mathematical modeling type operations. And I'd like to plug those in and kind of pretend that I've got virtual data. Anytime you ask the question, I can use the math to actually connect it to what I am storing, and I can give you the answer in your terms based on the assumptions and models and so on in my context. And then again, expect that as you do all this stuff, especially as it starts to get complex, and if it doesn't sound a little bit complex already, then I'm not doing my job, right? If I have all these assumptions underneath, somebody's going to come back and say, well, you just said climate change is happening at this pace. What assumptions did you make? We're going to have to track back through that. And if we start using these kinds of repositories where the assumptions are part of the context, we've got to have provenance that can handle that. So I need provenance of where the data came from, which sensors, what calibration of the sensors, how did you analyze it to get there, which context did you go through that made assumptions about things. I don't know if you guys are aware, but if you remember the ozone hole stuff, when I was a experimental chemistry grad student back at Berkeley, we had a talk by somebody who said the satellites missed the ozone hole for many years because they had an implicit assumption in their data storage that if the value went too low, it must be that the satellite wasn't working that day, and so they flagged that as bad data. The people on the ground were seeing this big hole, and the satellite guys were saying, there's no hole there. And then they went back and looked, and every time there was a hole, they were getting bad data signals, and of course it was real. It was just outside the bounds they expected, and as soon as they caught that assumption, voila, both things agreed there was an ozone hole. So we've got to be able to track back and find those hidden assumptions and have somebody re-question them. We have to do that with mutable objects, as I said, and we're also going to have things where provenance itself is going to be something that once I tell you the provenance, you're either going to trust me or not, so you have to start having the provenance of the provenance. How long ago did I write down that this stuff was here? Did I tell you that this data came off of this sensor before or after the lawsuit, right? And do I have a signature on it so I can prove that I wrote it down before it became a concern and I might want to have fudged it and so on. All right, so if we've got all that design, let's go build from that design. And again, now what I'll start telling you about is a lot of work that we started when I was at NCSA, a lot with our Cyber Environments Directorate. We liberally pulled from other open source tools. So again, this is a mishmash of things that we built, things that we stole and integrated. And I think, to be fair, right, we've got parts of the answer of all the design. I just said not all of it. So I'll try and now give you a sense of at least the beginnings and the flavor of how this all goes together. So the thing sitting in the middle of what we did is something that we call Tupelo2. Joe Futrell and folks in his subgroup down there were kind of the major contributors, and this actually started as a redesign of something that was more constricting and more OWL rather than RDF oriented back in the original NEAS project, the earthquake engineering thing, if you remember that far back. And basically what it is it's middleware that does exactly what I was saying about semantic content management. It has out the top a web protocol that you can get and put metadata and get and put data. You get and put the metadata as RDF statements. It uses global identifiers, but it takes whatever global identifiers you have and uses them. So if you want DOIs or whatever, it's treating it just like you would on the web. Those are things that it attaches other statements to, but it doesn't deal with the minting part. It is basically middleware, so you can put that on top of the metadata. Either goes into a relational store, run as a triple store, or directly into something like Jenna or other semantic tools, but you're basically storing the triples down the bottom, and you're storing the blobs in the file system. And again, you can play with a little bit if you want to put all of that in Oracle and put semantic stuff in the semantic part, and blobs, you use blobs in Oracle as stuff, you can do that as well. But essentially what Tupelo is doing is making sure you have a common interface that's that get and set metadata, get and set the blob. It has a Hojo API, so plain old Java objects. Essentially that's kind of a hibernate layer. So as soon as you say semantic web, people get afraid. But really what you can do with this is say I've got a person object and it's got a name, an address, and a phone number. And you can say I want to create a session. I want to read all the person objects that are associated with this company, and it will go out and query for the triples of which person has phone number X, has address Y, has name Z, and load those into the Java object for you. And there's basically a layer back there that says, here's my Java object and the variables it has. Here's the RDF statements that you have to go pull, read or write to create one of those objects, and it hides those. So essentially the same kind of thing that Hibernate does when it's taking your object and turning it into relational tables. We're trying to do the same thing into a triple level. So again, you can start saying, well, I can build an application that thinks it has objects. It writes out triples. Those things are now available to other applications, either as people objects or just things with names, right? They haven't had to buy into your idea of a people object because they've got the straight triple that this thing has name X. And if all they know about is how to tell you named objects like a file system would, it can show you a whole file system kind of view of people with names. Doesn't know that they're people, doesn't know about the other parts of people, but you can kind of mix and match between applications that way. And so again, if you follow semantic web stuff, you may remember back to MIT had some stuff called Haystack and then BioHaystack for a while that was doing the same kind of mix and match between things where they had a person with an address little applet and they had a phone number applet, and basically when you selected the person over here with the address, it would send a message out that just had the ID of the person, and anything else that was sitting on the screen that knew it dealt with people, with things of type person, would flag that and say, well, let me go retrieve the triple that says the phone number, and I'll go scroll down in my list to show you the phone number for that person. And the next one over would say, well, I know calendars for people, so if you just give me the person ID, I'll show you the calendar. So these things which really had no connection beyond having there's an event happened and there's some semantic data underneath, they weren't written to work with each other, and yet they were able to look like a unified application, because as soon as you had the selection in one, the other thing did whatever it knew how to do with that selection. And it had sort of a magical feel to it that you thought this was a really integrated thing, and yet none of these things had ever been put together before. And I'll try and convince you that we've got some of that kind of stuff in the geospatial world with the extra stuff on here. Okay, and the last piece is that Tupelo is also, I'll mention a little bit more about the streaming support on a couple more slides. The last thing I just want to point out is that there is sort of this computational inference. Basically, you can either put plugins or probably more to say you can put a layer in here where you can make it look like Tupelo at the top that thinks in terms of like things in Ann Arbor. You can put a geospatial index in the middle, and then you can write GPS locations down here. It looks like Tupelo at the top. It looks like Tupelo at the bottom. There's some math in the middle that mixes your vocabularies and your concepts for you. But you basically think that whether you wrote things in terms of where the sensors were in Ann Arbor directly in the triple store, you had that layer in the middle, the application doesn't know the difference. Okay, so with this, we basically, with this much infrastructure, you can do fun things like Medici that we built. This is Luigi Marini and Rob Cooper and others down at NCSA. Basically, we tried to put together sort of a Flickr-style interface on top of semantic content management. And so what it does is basically you can upload images. In fact, because it's a content management system and not an image one, if you put documents up there, you can put spatial files, you can put 3D CAD drawings, whatever you want to do. And sort of what it knows how to do is give you an overview of them, show a preview of them, give you metadata about them, let you put a license on it, let you put tags on it. Down at the bottom where it's not showing, you can have a little threaded discussion about them. And everything else in there is basically something that you can do per content type. So when we do hit images, one of the things that we do is we launch a computation that says, well, images are known to have thumbnails and they're known to have image pyramids that allow you to zoom. We will go generate those and go write them out, or we'll be able to compute on the fly for some of this stuff. So basically when you drop the image in, it does that background calculation, and now we've got the ability to show you the thumbnail. And I think I didn't end up putting in the slide, but basically this is something, if you click the little zoom button, it pops up Microsoft C-Drag and you can go zoom in on the image. If it's a CAD drawing, when it comes in, it basically says this part of the page belongs to the CAD viewer, and you can get the rotating 3D CAD drawing instead of the image drawing. If it's a PDF file, when you drop it in, it basically uses a PDF viewer, and I think we're going from basically showing the first page of the PDF to now it actually gives you a little previewer that's got back and forward arrows, and you can see each page of the PDF as an image file up here as well. So again, think about anything you want to drop in here. Calculate some derived data products from it, thumbnails, pyramids. When I was up here last time at Michigan, we were talking to people who were doing microscopy, where they were interested in sort of atomic scale. They were interested in how many sort of steps down atomically and how many islands are on there, and they had a little algorithm for that. So I was saying, well, drop it in here, put your algorithm in, and basically have two more pieces of metadata show up on the side that say number of steps, number of islands that you calculated and that then got stored in here. Yep.
Is the viewer customizable by a new data type? I want to add a view,
Yep.
or even an existing data type like an image,
Yep.
and I want a
Yep.
different view of that?
Yep.
So is that something running on the client machine, or is it running on the server side?
It depends. So something like C-Dragon, I think, is running in your browser, but it has to have a certain file, pyramid of files on the back end to be able to pull it up and do the zooming. So if it's a Java applet that you pull up there, it's all going to be on the client side. If it's something like C-Dragon, it's actually, there's logic on the front end, but it's dynamically pulling files from the back end to give you the current place where you're zoomed and panned in. And it could be all just, it could be statically, you just generated a derived image.
So do you have a mechanism for people to upload their, scripts or viewers? And what's the mechanism, policy on?
I think at the API level there is. There's not, part of this kind of stuff comes from, if you know my history, I used to do electronic lab notebooks, and we had much more of an exposed plugin mechanism where you could actually go and use the tool itself to drop in a new viewer, and as soon as you did, it would allow you to use the new viewer, so you had sort of a really user-side thing. We don't have that in Medici yet, but that would be a nice place to go. The last thing I want to point out with images as an example again, if your camera knows what the lighting conditions were and what f-stop you used and whether you turned the flash on or not and so on, one more thing we do when you drop an image in is take a look inside the file, and again, where you can't see down here, we've got a whole list of all the things that the camera knew in the vocabulary from your camera, the GPIF or whatever that vocabulary is. So again, you can think of anything where if you've got a comma-separated value file and you know that parts of that file are metadata, if you can write something to pull that out and create triples, you can have that become part of the upload process. So that's kind of the basic thing where now we've got one interface, we can drop stuff in, we can get metadata out, we can have some dynamic generation of derived content, and we can see it from the user. And when I say Flickr style, we had a good discussion way back when with Seed about what that meant, and I think one of the things I took away with is that Flickr, when you drop your image in, you see it immediately, and they don't ask you to fill out a big form with all of this information. It shows up blank, and then you can go type it in. So that Medici does that as well. If you want to go and change the title, or click on here after the fact and change the license, or go add a tag after the fact, you can kind of do those, and they automatically, as soon as you type a new tag, it uploads, it regenerates that part of the page. It doesn't require a big refresh. There's no submit button that does anything. All right. Now let's have some more fun. If we really want to start thinking about sensors and those sorts of things, we're going to have some notion of time. So Alejandro Rodriguez down at NCSA was a postdoc there for a while, went off to, if I recall right, to Amazon, did a great job with time annotated RDF, and basically put together a layer where we had the idea of a stream as something with an ID, and then frames in the stream that each had a timestamp. And then when you wrote the next one, you'd write another frame with another timestamp, another frame with another timestamp. And as that stuff was coming in, he would keep an index in a relational table, because triple stores don't normally do a good job of saying, you know, find me things where the value of the time is between this time and this time. It's easier and faster if I go stick that in a relational table. As the timestamps go by, I can use all the relational mechanisms to get that out. And then he basically took the Sparkle query language and said, you know, if I actually time annotate the RDF so I can do things like saying, select a temperature from a stream where it's a Chicago stream, and it's what I want is sort of the last time step that's of the temperature. It'll go find out which frame it was and pull that back out. So essentially what you're able to do is kind of do a query in terms of, give me the stuff from noon to 2 yesterday, give me the latest one. And if you go read the paper that he's put on this, he's actually made a sort of one-for-one mapping that you can take this and unbundle it into traditional RDF with nothing on it and do the query and get the answer out. So really all he's done is sort of keep an index to make that faster and giving you a simpler syntax to deal with talking about streams. You say, I want that sensor and I'd like to know what it did last week. And now you can write that out. And go one step further with fun. I'd like to do that with a workflow where I want the workflow to run on a weekly basis, and I always want it to get the last 3 days of information. You can write the workflow in terms of last 3 days of information rather than saying the workflow must pull certain files out. So you can kind of have this idea where you've got recurring things that work in terms of a time interval that then automatically you pull out the right data from the file system. Yep.
Is this, when this query is made, is it like a one-time query, or is this a on-continuous query?
For this is basically just a query you could go throw in the front end of Tupelo and go ask it on demand.
So it's looking at past data that's being deposited.
Right, we don't have the idea of an active trigger that's kind of sitting there and doing this on an ongoing basis right now.
So there's a project that actually my group did a while back. That was for location sensing originally, but it's turned into a sensor project. So whereabouts, it's research for whereabouts in front of the project. But it's going to be a nice addition to this because it's got the notion of the trigger side, which is that you got sensor data coming in, and a user can submit a subscription in the form of like constraints on the attributes, and this would include like timing or location or whatever,
Right.
and then you can get back a stream. So it might be an interesting.
Yep.
problem.
Okay, great. You can expand that, and I think I won't say much about this, and you don't have to read that. But basically, work since I've left there by Zhong Li and Young Liu and others have taken this idea of temporal streams and tried to get geospatial streams, geospatial temporal streams, where they will allow you, in addition to kind of talking about the times with the time annotated RDF, to add in your open geospatial consortium relationships of thing in something else, thing next to something else, those kind of words. And they do essentially the same model. You have a stream that has measurements that you give timestamps and GPS coordinates. That's just RDF data that goes off into Tupelo, but on the way you keep a temporal index and you keep a spatial index, and then when you query about something like in Ann Arbor, you've got enough information sitting in this middle layer to be efficient at doing the translation and doing the geospatial math to give you the right answer out. And if we now have that kind of mechanism, then we can do fun stuff like digital watersheds, where, again, the text is not quite the point I want to make on it, but digital watersheds, this is the farms south of NCSA, University of Illinois, their research farms. This is Chicago, but these are all spatial layers that are stored off in Tupelo. They're populated by a query out to Tupelo in that middleware for what are your geospatial things. When you click on them, you go basically do the Google Maps kind of thing and turn the overlays on and off on the maps. You can do fun stuff like this is a model where we were pulling in NexRad radar data to generate precipitation estimates point by point. And you could come along to the website and say, I actually don't care about point by point. These are sewer sheds in Chicago, right? Different places where all the water in that area goes down one sewer pipe, where in some places in Chicago, you have the ability to open or close pipes or drain the water out of the reservoir right behind that pipe. So if I know how much water is coming in, I have a better chance of managing my sewer system. So you can actually upload a KML file to this, and from then on, it'll basically do the repeating thing you were talking about, a tool of kind of, every time the next radar data comes in, it will generate a new stream that tells you how much rainfall happened in this area, this area, this area, and this area. So you could actually start thinking about generating things out of triggers. More digital watershed stuff. Basically, we had things down in Corpus Christi Bay for a while as part of the Waters Network planning and some of the pre-runner projects before that, that they were looking at. Corpus Christi has a problem where nutrients, which you may call pollutants, are not come down and basically cause low oxygen conditions and then cause fish kills and so on. So they're trying to understand where and when those occur. So they were looking at water temperature and salinity, things like the wind, things like the chemicals in the water at that point. And it's pretty easy to kind of overlay where the sensors are on the map. It's not too tricky to do things like allow you to click on that and show you the time stream at those locations. We just use pieces of Tupelo to go one more step and actually give you sort of a historical summary and overview that as this data was going in, you could look at the time stream and say, well, actually the data on, I'm not sure I can read this either, so I'll just pretend that this is the wind speed. The wind speed's at the high end of the normal range and it's still increasing. So you've got a sense not only of just the, what's the value right now or what's the whole time stream, but you got a sense that normal conditions or gosh, something's really weird, that's way out of whack. You know, maybe this is the time I want to go send my grad student out in a boat and take some physical samples out there. So you get a quick overview. So again, this idea that these are not the raw values going in the database, but they're something you want to keep up to date. They're the kinds of things you want to query on and actually show displays about. And they can all interact with sort of the straight sensors writing into Tupelo. You can pull this kind of stuff out in a completely different application and kind of get a different view of the same data. Okay, so I'm continuing to hop forward and hopefully confusing you royally. I had one more piece in here about provenance and kind of start with sort of the state of the art a few years ago with all the groups that came together to do the open provenance model. This was a lot of the major scientific workflow engines as well as other people interested in provenance. And essentially it covers the idea that there are things, artifacts, files, physical things that we're going to pretend are immutable, that go through processes, and new artifacts come out the other side. So I take a file, I edit it, I got a new file. I take eggs and flour and I go through a baking process and I have a cake. That's the kind of model that we had. And basically we found that everybody who was doing workflow and everybody who's trying to record this essentially had that kind of a model with a couple additions that sometimes you'd like to talk about who's controlling the process. So you've got, there were things that were inputs that were used in the process. There are things that are generated by the process. Agents can control the process. Then there were people who are taking shorthands and saying, I don't know what happened, that this process produced something that another process picked up. I don't know what that is, so I'll just say this process caused that process to happen, and I won't talk about the thing that went between them. Or I know that this thing was derived from that one, and I don't know what the process was, so I'd like to just sort of ignore the fact that there was probably a process in the middle and just tell you this is directly derived from that. With that much stuff, again, kind of added into semantic content management, you now get to do fun things. And this one I'm cheating because this one doesn't actually use Tupelo, but we did an earthquake simulation environment where you could go all the way from ground motions to building damage up to how likely are people in that building to get hurt. If I move my emergency supplies into this hospital, am I going to save more lives than the other one? Am I going to save money if I retrofit this bridge versus that bridge? Kind of walk up that whole chain, and by adding provenance into this, I've got content management. I can gather data from remote sources. I can gather local data that a professor has and merge them together. And now I can do this processing step by step and keep track. When I get a result, I can ask, which ground motion did I start from? What assumptions did I make on my hospital? Which model, what version of which model did I use? All that sort of stuff is now recordable with the infrastructure that we've talked about. So we're getting pretty good. We got a lot of things covered at this point. And I think that's where we kind of get the input to seed that says we're not completely crazy, that we can do something useful for sustainability researchers at this point. This stuff is things that we're using in various projects. It's not all pulled together, but the idea in seed is to kind of do the next step of pulling that together. And I hope I've given you a little bit of a sense that with things like, this is just another earlier version of Medici, you can do some fun things with. If you think about the geospatial world, if you think about how many geospatial layers are out there, right? There are tens and hundreds of thousands of potential layers. If I gave you a little interface for geospatial stuff and gave you a file tree over here that you had to go search through those 100,000 layers to find yours that are interest, right, it's going to quickly get unusable. If you can drop some things into seed and tag the ones that belong to your project or tags the ones that are of your interest, and then go back over here and say, just show me the layers that belong to that tag. Now I've got a much smaller set, and now I can go turn them on and off in the geospatial thing. So the idea I'm trying to get across there is that Medici wasn't necessarily built to do geospatial mapping, but the idea that you've got some place to put some tags and deal with metadata, you can now have these two applications kind of work together without a lot of coordination at sort of top-down management. And if somebody else in the seed community, in the sustainability research community wants to say, I have a better way to do mapping than you guys do, they can start doing the same things. They can use the same tags. They can say, oh, I actually want two other pieces of metadata. If I can pick that up from Medici, I don't have to put an input on my thing, and I can now show you my new maps. So hopefully we're getting to where you can have, like the MIT Haystack stuff, have much more of an ecosystem model where new applications reuse the data and metadata, but don't have a lot of other connections that they have to sort of talk in lockstep to any of these applications. And again, if you, I guess I don't have the picture on this one, I have it on the next one. In seed, we're going to look at using Vivo sort of as a faculty research interest repository. So Vivo is run by a consortium of universities, and it's basically modeling faculty has a research group as part of a department, has these grants, and these papers and presentations are part of that research, came from that grant, authored by these people type of information. We can think about fairly easy integrations in seed with, we'd like to know the creator of this data. Right now, that's a type-in string. It's not too hard to think about having, I click the button here for who's the creator of the data, and it goes over and looks at Vivo and says, well, here's the list of people. Select one of those and get their real ID out of Vivo. And now what I put here instead of just a string is I put a link to Vivo. So Medici will show a link. You click on the link that's your name, and you'll go over into your Vivo space onto that page, and you can go find out more. Or I can say this paper, this data was published in a paper. Let Vivo keep track of the paper, who authored it, where did it get submitted, all the good citation stuff. All I really need here is to basically have a link that this data was connected to that paper off in the other system, and I can now sort of walk back and forth. So I haven't had to build one application that does all this stuff. I can walk between them. And to give away one more seed thing here, so that's essentially the idea on the front end of a lot of these things, where you've got things coming in from Medici, people uploading data, sensors and workflow systems that are automatically putting the same stuff in, and again, kind of recording the same way with triples to keep track of the metadata and the provenance, Vivo information, which we can then pump out through these geospatial interfaces. And all these things are really just contributing to a big graph of things connected by relationships to other things. Now what seed would really like to do is keep all of that in a coherent way for the next 100 years, while that graph keeps evolving as new people write new papers about it and so on. So what we can start thinking about is, what are the right ways to kind of lasso some part of that graph, turn it into a more normal object, like a OAIS object that would go into an institutional database that could be frozen, that could be signed, that's all packaged up so we know we're going to be able to preserve it in standard language. And so seed is going to kind of look at this, where we've got all of this stuff with an active content repository that can take absolutely anything as you make it, give you useful information back on that so you're motivated to put it in. People who are talking about it contribute their information, and then curators can kind of mine that rather than having to go out at the end of a project and say, could you please tell me additional metadata? They can mine all that active space to actually get the long-term archival things. All right, so with that, that's all I'm going to tell you about seed, but I hope that the idea of the semantic content framework and some of those other pieces gives you a sense that, again, it's not a huge leap to go from where we are to thinking that we could put together this over the next 2 years for a prototype and 5 years for something that's going to stand up and help people. All right, so I've got, I don't know what the blank slide was supposed to be. Maybe it was just a pause for me. The last thing I want to do is kind of delve a little bit more directly into the provenance question from the W3C group. And this is basically stuff that I started thinking about through the International Provenance and Annotation Workshop series, and basically started talking about this kind of problem, which I kind of told you about already, right? If I've got the idea of I've got a file that I run through a model and I get a new results file, that looks pretty reasonable. Oh, the open provenance model covers it. If I talk about a naive Descartes who has a thought and becomes an informed Descartes and is not the same Descartes as before, it sounds completely unreasonable. Right? We've got some sense that Descartes thought, therefore he was, but he was the same person as before. So I actually wrote a paper called I Think, Therefore I'm Someone Else, just to have fun with this whole thing. But we do have some precedent here that we've got things sort of as static answers. People have looked at this in various ways. So things like versions, WebDAV has this delta V spec, basically says, right, there was version 1, there were version 2A and 2B, and then version 3. And there's this versionable resource which has that overall history of all the versions. And I have some notion that I could ask you for the latest version of this versionable resource and get whatever's at the end of the line here. That's kind of part of WebDAV, it's kind of the versioning model. That really starts to link this idea that there's something that can change and there are different states of it or different views of it over time. The functional requirements for bibliographic record standard has the same kind of hierarchy that they break it into 4 parts. That there's a work, some symphony, there's an expression of that, a certain score for the symphony, manifestation of that, that thing as conducted by a certain conductor, and then there's an item, when he did that on last Tuesday, that particular performance. All of those things are kind of like versions, right? All these are sort of versions of the symphony, but the symphony doesn't have a date of performance, so they're not the same kind of object, but they're related views of the object. Same thing, this thing doesn't have something that you can point to and say, is this thing a text string, right? This is where Alan Rainier down at Illinois gets upset, right? That if that's a text string, you have to tell me what the text string is, and by logic, it can't go changing around because it doesn't make any sense to say I changed the text string. Text string exists before and after I write it in a file, so this versionable thing can't be a text string, and yet we'd like these versions to be very much text string oriented. They are files, they are text strings. This thing is sort of more of a logical idea of a document. And the same thing we have in replica management. You have the idea of a logical resource and physical copies that are put in different places, some of which might be zipped, so they're not byte for byte the same, but logically they all have the same content. So you'd like to be able to walk back and forth across these things. And I think that this is where the 2,000 years of philosophy comes in. There are a lot of kind of questions where people have been thinking about this for a long time of how do you deal with those kinds of relationships and what do they mean? Carol Goebel, when they were doing bioinformatics, the idea that there was a query that I ran on a database and the query answer inside their system, they gave them 2 different identifiers but basically tried to consider them aliases. That works until you and I do the same query, even off the same version of the database. If we both do the same query and I do it first, I win the Nobel Prize and you don't, right? So even things that are mathematically the same on disk, because they have a different sort of academic meaning, and intellectual property meaning are different. Lots of discussion in philosophy about continuance and occurrence of things sort of in time and out of time that I'll avoid getting into. But I read a paper a couple of years ago, again with a nice title called "The Water Falls, but the Waterfall Does Not Fall," where basically they made the argument that what we think of as objects could really be thought of as being defined by the processes we consider to be part of their life cycle. So if I have a rock and I consider throwing to be part of its life cycle, I've got one idea of a rock. If I have a rock and I say that being chipped is part of the rock's life cycle, that idea of a rock doesn't have a fixed mass. If I say that chipping is not part of the life cycle, then I've got a rock whose mass is fixed, and I can go ask you for the 10-pound rock, and you should be able to find the one I'm talking about. So there's these very subtle gradations of which process is internal or not. And now we've got the tie to provenance. Basically, I have things like a person. If they are allowed to engage in certain processes, then you can talk about sort of the naive person beforehand and the informed person afterwards as being aspects of that person who is engaging that as part of their life cycle. And the notion that this thing is basically a view of that thing that is allowed to basically, education makes these things appear and disappear, education just subtly changes that one. And so just with that much additional, these two kinds of additional relationships, you suddenly get provenance that you can do all sorts of fun things with. And I think this one's just animation I don't need. But you basically can now start saying that I've got a paper that is an idea that I wrote one document about, and then I printed that document and I got a paper thing. They're both my paper. One's digital, one's not. Printing is a process that sort of consumes digital stuff and produces paper stuff, but they're both my paper in some logical sense. That document was a file at one point, and I copied it, got another file. They're both logically the same document because they've got the same content, but on my file system, they're actually two different files that except for the fact that copying changes these guys and doesn't really affect this guy, copying is part of a document's life cycle, it's okay. Kind of go on down. There's a string, this document file. Strings are destroyed by editing processes to create new strings, but files are mutable in that way. You can start to string this all together, and the reason you want to start doing that is think of all the, again, sort of cross-analysis, cross-checking. If I find out down here that this document file was actually written to a part of my disk that's known to have bad sectors, I might think that after I made a copy, this one might not be the same anymore, and I should go check. So the guy who can report, the debugger on my system that can tell me about bad disk sectors, has no idea about papers and can't really report to you any provenance of a paper. But it can tell you about what happened to disk sectors, and as long as I can say, well, those sectors for a while were part of that file, I can start to figure out how I'm going to put those stories together and actually understand the bigger picture. So again, now think of climate change and think of the ozone hole, where you have to go back and say, well, I don't know, I've got no evidence of the ozone hole, but if I actually go back and look at the satellite, there was something that was reporting when the satellite was reporting errors and not. If I correlate that with the times of the measurements of the ozone hole, suddenly I can start to figure out the picture that, gosh, right, somebody programmed the satellite wrong and we had a problem. And you can even do fun things now of sort of understanding seeming paradoxes. So does anybody know Theseus's ship? Basically the paradox of there's a ship made of wood, and you go and replace it piece by piece, swapping out each piece of wood, and then you sort of ask, is this the same ship or not? Right, and that's hard to answer if you're thinking about which ship gets to park in the berth because it's got a license versus which one, which museum has the wood that was the original thing from back then. As soon as you start saying, well, gosh, those are actually not two things. There's one point where the physical ship and the sort of legal ship were aspects of each other, and then after that, they diverged because the physical ship, all the wood went into the scrap pile, and the logical ship kept going because it's not actually the same ship. They are related, but wood replacement is part of the logical ship's life cycle. It's not part of the physical ship's life cycle. So as soon as I realize that, I can start writing down all this stuff and at least have the computer sort of show me why this paradox isn't really a paradox if I actually write it out the right way. So that to me, that's cool. So we've had lots of discussions about, are we solving philosophical problems or are we just sort of diagramming them well? And I've tried to push that all we're trying to do is diagram them well, not get into philosophy itself, but just take their lessons and figure out a good way to write things down so you can go farther. So where are we? And again, I'm almost at conclusion here. We have a way to store through sort of content management. We can store any and all data. We can do things around the edges like content management of set up particular kinds of processing or data derivation for different kinds of content. We can pull metadata out of the blobs and make it explicit. We can manage context. We have places where we can put some of these assumptions and data derivation things in. So you can use them if you want to use that context or go around them if you don't. We have web and desktop applications, sort of API level things to be able to build things, and we've got some compatible apps for sort of, right, just see things through Medici, do some simple geospatial stuff. So hopefully, as I've said a couple of times now, Seed's got a good base to kind of go farther than other people have in supporting this cross-disciplinary work, and at least has a chance with some of these things with provenance to get to some of the hairy issues when two different people start to have these thesis-ship kind of paradoxes of the way you think about your discipline doesn't match with mine. How are we going to even figure out how to put our data together? As can you. This stuff is out there, open source. Hopefully some of you will think this way after the talk and start trying to solve similar problems in different disciplines. The absolutely last thing before acknowledgements is just to kind of pull this all the way back to cognition, as I promised at the beginning. Like I said, I've been to talks where they're starting to think, your brain tissue, if you look at it at small scale, isn't specialized into visual processing and other processing. It's all the same kinds of cells. So it starts to lead you down the road of thinking, what's the generic thing that your entire brain is doing that when you do it with visual input gives you different answers than when you have auditory input, gives you different answers from other senses and so on. So the question is sort of, could it be that your brain is basically doing this kind of storing whatever it gets, trying to look at it knows what it saw right now, a bunch of stripes, for example. It knows in 2 minutes that those stripes are over here, and it starts trying to do some spatio-temporal pattern matching and saying, hey, look, there seem to be a whole bunch of times where those stripes move together, and in fact, if I wave my hand and push, all the stripes go so that those stripes seem to have some coherence. For pushing, it doesn't destroy the stripe pattern, so somehow pushing is part of the life cycle of those stripes. Maybe I'll call that a zebra or a striped block. And then does that work? And can I then sort of put this context shifting in there so that I can say, when I actually hit those stripes with a hammer, they broke apart, so I can go back and forth and say, what I really saw was stripes. I thought it was a block, but evidently blocks are not. Right? Blocks can be destroyed because there are some things like hitting them with a hammer that makes them fall apart. And so I guess I would posit it to people out there that if you have these things that I can keep sort of the low-level things that I see and sense, keep track of them over time, do the pattern recognition, and then just recognize that all the time I kind of have to hop up and down that ladder and start asking the question of, when do those patterns, when do I find one more process where that pattern either stays because it's part of the life cycle or not, and that's when it's not part of the life cycle, now I've basically got to go hop up another level of description and go figure out that. If that's what our brain is doing, all of that all the time, that seems like a useful model of cognition, and it also, again, kind of explains back in the other direction that if we're doing this naturally, right, the sort of closer we come to how we think, the harder it is for us to kind of describe it. So maybe that's the reason we're kind of not writing this down in the way we do data management, because it's sort of getting too close to home. So flip that around. Hopefully we're getting closer to really thinking and describing things the way that humans think about them as we start down this road. All right, so with that, I will thank lots of people. As I mentioned, NCSA Cyber Environments group down there has done a lot of the work. We had Office of Naval Research support to do a lot of the prototyping work we've seen. So the idea of knowledge spaces, Tupelo, Medici, some of those things have all been down there by various members I've tried to mention some of. A lot of good provenance discussions, both with people in Illinois, as well as the provenance groups and so on. At RPI, we have my center and the Tetherless World Constellation that are kind of looking at some of the how do we make efficient data storage, how do we get more of the semantic web stuff into this. The SEED team, I thank them at least for perseverance. You go back and look in C-Tools up here, and it was 2008, 2009 when the proposal went in, so we've basically been waiting that long for everything to go. And then various funding agencies over time. So, and lastly, thank you for listening. And I'll put up my last little slide. Hopefully, you who had a nice coherent understanding of data before this talk, hopefully you're in a different state, and B, hopefully that's a better and nicer one than it was before, rather than just completely confused. So thanks.